Hi, it's Richard with Student Engagement Staff for GCC again. Continuing our discussion through Kant in our textbook for Philosophy 101. Hopefully what we talked about last time began to make some sense. We finished up on page 498 in the 4th edition, which would be 467 in the 5th edition for those of you following along. And we looked at Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative. And here, in his exact words, act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. We talked about how this was the principle of universalizability. Can you universalize the maxim or the moral law so you would want everybody to act on it at this moment? I want to continue on 498 and 467 if you have the 5th edition. Our author of the textbook, Chaffee, calls this formulation conceptually revolutionary. It's a nice way of saying, there's something new, something powerful here, something distinct. Previous moral theories you can see lists there focused on the content of a moral action, such as thou shalt not kill. What does that mean, the content of it? Or the intention of an action, what's your intention? Or the character of the person, are they a virtuous person, or are they maybe more of a scoundrel? Instead, Kant focuses on the logical form, and that's going to be important, the logical form of the argumentation itself, of the maxim. Matter of fact, key readings here are on page 498, the very bottom here, through 499 and into 500. So I want to spend a little bit of time reading this section because I think this gets to the heart of what Kant is trying to do with the categorical imperative, and particularly this about how do we universalize it. What is it we're attempting to discover? You see in the very last sentence there on 498, what determines the moral value of an action is not its content, consequences, intention, or the character of the individual acting. We're in 499 now. It is whether it is logically consistent for the action to be practiced by all women and men. For example, he gives an example. Should you choose to tell a lie to protect a decent person's reputation from being ruined? So there's going to be a person there's going to be a scandalous lie. Should you lie to protect that person's reputation? Kant's categorical imperative, Chaffee goes on, says, mandates that we ask and try to answer the following question to determine what to do. Is it logically consistent to will that all people, in all comparable circumstances, tell a lie to protect a decent person's reputation? If we apply this standard, Kant believes the answer is clear. It is morally wrong to tell a lie in these or any other circumstances. Why? Because if we endorse the moral rightness of telling a lie, like it's okay to tell it in this situation, then we would never have reason to believe people when they assured us they were telling the truth. For all we know, they might be lying to protect someone's reputation or some other worthy reason, and they would be confident that they were taking the morally correct action. But if lying, Chaffee goes on, becomes a morally correct action, then the concept of telling the truth loses all meaning and value. That's the key. It's precisely because telling the truth is often difficult and disturbing that the concept has moral value. But if telling the truth and not telling the truth, lying, both can be morally right, then both concepts become meaningless. Why? Because now you have a contradiction. It is right to tell a lie, it is right not to tell a lie at the same time, and you have a contradiction. That would result, as Chaffee says, in a very chaotic and unlivable world indeed, because we would never be able to depend on the accuracy of what anyone said to us. As a result, telling a lie to protect someone's reputation fails the test of the categorical imperative, because if we attempt to universalize it, to will that everyone take the same action in similar circumstances, the result is logically inconsistent and so morally wrong. What's key in this, what I did, I actually, on this page, I circled the phrase logically consistent or the phrase logically inconsistent. It appears 5 different times. So the author's Chaffee is trying to get us to realize, again, it's not the content, not the character. If you universalize the maxim, is it consistent logically? And if not, you know that it is not a categorical imperative and it's not something you should obey. The very last little paragraph there at 499, Kant's metaphysical morals is based on the concepts that humans are first and foremost rational creatures. And as such, we are necessarily committed to the belief in logical consistency. For rational creatures, it is offensive and unacceptable to promote beliefs that are logically inconsistent. Somebody, as an aside, might want to challenge the fact that we are rational creatures. But for Kant, that's a given. We are rational creatures. We ought to ground our ethics in reason, and if something is contradictory, it's unreasonable and therefore cannot be true, and therefore cannot be something we live in terms of an ethical system with. On page 500, you can see, what about the question? Somebody might say, well, what about if I say it's okay for me to lie because I'm special? And Kant deals with that on page 500. At least Chaffee talks about Kant's response. On a few paragraphs down, he says, Kant's response is that to believe that you are different from others, or therefore special or unique or superior, is an irrational belief. Reason insists that we are impartial. Again, so it's not reasonable to think that you're special, that you're somehow different than other creatures that also have reason themselves. Now on page 500, he begins to do something with some readings, and our author Chaffee lists out 4 examples. Kant has 4 examples that sort of flesh out what he means, or how this first formulation of the categorical imperative would work out. What does it mean to universalize a maxim? And the first one he mentions on 500 is suicide. Is it right to commit suicide? And Kant's going to argue, no, it's never right to commit suicide. You can see in the green box, in the green section there on 500 in Kant's words, sort of in the very middle, now we see at once that a system of nature of which it should be a law to destroy life by means of the very feeling whose special nature it is to impel the improvement of life would contradict itself and therefore could not exist as a system of nature. What's he getting at there? That's sort of some difficult language. But Chaffee actually explains it very nicely. At the very bottom of 500, the last line, suicide is morally wrong. Now we're in 501. Why? Not because it violates God's law or because it would be a waste of a human life. Instead, Kant believes it is wrong because it is logically inconsistent, involving a belief in the following 2 contradictory propositions, and he lists them out. Number 1, suicide would be an act of self-love, because I'm convinced that continuing my life is likely to bring me more evil than satisfaction. So Kant says what motivates the person to commit suicide, at least the way Kant is thinking, is this idea of self-love. I care about myself. I want the pain to stop. The second proposition would be this: by its nature, self-love seeks to perpetuate and improve my life. And Kant says these 2 things are at odds. They're self-contradictory. The very nature of self-love seeks to promote its existence, and now I'm arguing, no, my self-love promotes my non-existence. That's contradictory, so Kant says, therefore suicide is not correct. As an aside, you simply could ask this question. It's not in our text, but when Kant says suicide would be an act of self-love, could it be that suicide is an act of love for others? We'd have to wrestle with that issue. What would Kant say to that? Well, that's the first thing. Suicide is always wrong according to Kant. What about his second example? Borrowing money knowing that he can't pay something back. So some person takes out a loan knowing he can't pay it back, but he says, I'm going to sign the paperwork anyways for this loan, knowing I can never pay it back and still take the money. Kant says, is this right? He says, no, this was actually wrong. You can see the green section on 501 there. At the very center he says, I change then the suggestion of self-love into a moral law and state the question thus: how would it be a maxim if it were universal law? So he's applying the universal principle. Then I see at once that it could never hold as a universal law of nature, but would necessarily contradict itself. Looking for contradiction again. For supposing it to be a universal law that everyone who thinks himself in a difficulty should be able to promise whatever he pleases with the purpose of not keeping his promise, the promise itself would become impossible, as well as the end that one might have in view, in the sense that no longer would consider that anything was promised him, but would ridicule all such statements as vain pretenses. Again, difficult language, but if I will that everybody were to engage in this, that everybody were to essentially lie again, then the very concept of a promise becomes meaningless, and so it becomes contradictory. It contradicts itself. The very notion of a promise becomes meaningless. And so Kant says, because if you universalize it, and you find a contradiction or you find meaninglessness, therefore you know this can't be a maxim. Therefore you ought not to take out a loan, knowing that you cannot pay for it. And I think simply, I'm going to fault on that loan. His third example: what about somebody who says, I just want to be lazy. I don't want to have to work hard to develop myself. Somebody, I just want to sit on the couch, watch TV, binge watch, eat potato chips. Why should I go out, and work to better myself, maybe physically with physical exercise, maybe mentally, maybe I should going out and getting an education is difficult. It takes time. Doing homework, that's sometimes painful. Why would I want to do that? Why not just be lazy? And so on page 501 and then on to 502, he begins to talk about answering this one. 502 at the very top of the page, the last piece of the green section you'll see there. For as rational being, he necessarily wills that his faculties be developed, since they serve him and have been given him for all sorts of possible purposes. Again, he looks at the human being and says, no, you've been given this faculty of reason, and that he necessarily wills that his faculties be developed. That's something in us. And so then to not will it by saying, oh, I just want to be lazy, is a contradiction. Now again, there's some things here to think about. Here's a good place to stop and say this. It's important that we first understand Kant, and then we can go on to ask, is it true? Is he giving us the right ethical theory? But first of all, we want to make sure we understand what he's saying. He's universalizing these maxims, attempting to find, if he can, a contradiction. If he does, then we know it's not a categorical imperative. That's what he's doing in these examples. We might disagree now with his ethical reasoning. For example, here you could actually challenge, for as a rational being, he necessarily wills that his faculties be developed. Is that true? Since they serve him and have been given him for all sorts of possible purposes. Given him for purposes. The question we ought to ask, and anytime you see something like that, given by whom? If I went to a friend and said, hey, I got my new truck. It says 2020, brand new, F-150. It's got all the bells and whistles. And somebody gave it to me, and my friend asks, probably the question you want to ask, well, who did that? And does he want to give any more away? You could begin to ask, well, who is it that gives this to the human nature? I don't think for Kant it's necessarily God or some being like that. So you have to ask, where does that come from, Kant? Just perhaps a place to challenge him a bit at. Example number 4 is helping the poor. What about I just ignore the poor around me? He says, no, that can't be universal maxim, because if everybody universalizes ignoring the poor, we might find ourselves in a situation where we're in need sometime and we would want people to help, and that's the contradiction. Now I both want to not help and I also want the help if it's universalized, and so there's the contradiction. And so that's what comes up, for Kant in those 4 examples. Again, seek to understand what he's doing there, then you can challenge his thoughts and his premises at a secondary step. On page 503, we actually make a shift now to Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative, and this is key. So page 503 for the 4th edition, page 471 for the 5th edition. In the center of the page, interestingly enough, Chaffee writes, Kant extends his metaphysical morals to include another version of the categorical imperative, and you can see listed there in the italics, act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end withal, never as a means only. Key thing, treat people as ends, not as means. Don't treat people as instruments or things. I treat, a paintbrush. Actually, I pick up a paintbrush to use it as a means to paint a picture. The picture is the end. I want to treat that because I want the end of having the picture and the delight in it. I don't treat people that way. I don't treat them as things. Now, Kant does recognize we do this all the time. We do engage with each other as means. For example, you as a student are using your professor as a means to an education. I'm going to use you. But in that case, it's never only as a means. It's never merely as a means. You never think of them only as a thing or an instrument to be used for your personal desire. And so we can recognize we have these transactions where we use each other as means, but Kant's very clear to say never merely or only as a means. And this brings up some key readings on 504. We have the issue of things versus persons. In the green section there, he says about 4 or 5, 6 lines down, thus the worth of any object which is to be acquired by our actions is always conditional. Beings whose existence depends not on our wills but on natures have not, nevertheless, if they are irrational beings, only a relative value as means and are therefore called things. So the stuff we find in nature, like a rock, or Kant would even say pets and dogs and cats. If they are called things, rational things, on the contrary, are called persons because their very nature points them out as ends in themselves. It is the very nature of a rational being that he is an end in himself, not simply a tool for something else. And so he goes on in this discussion to talk about that, that the rational nature is an end in itself. The very last, second to last paragraph in this green section, the key phrase comes up again. The conception of every rational being as one which must consider itself as giving all the maxim of its will universal laws, so as to judge itself and its actions from this point of view, this conception leads to another which depends on it and is very fruitful, namely that of a kingdom of ends. What's that mean, a kingdom of ends? He goes on, he says, by a kingdom I understand the union of different rational beings in a system by common laws. So if everybody who has reason is an end in themselves, we're not to treat them like things, but as ends or persons, and we have a bunch of those together, a group, sort of a class of that, that's a kingdom, and it's a kingdom of ends. And so that we ought to create cultures and societies and laws which recognize people as ends, not as things. And so this is the key point here. A kingdom of ends is simply recognizing everybody together is an end in themselves, not simply to treat them as tools. On page 505, you can see the reading talks about how Kant says that we cannot love others more than we love ourselves. That's an interesting claim. We should understand it, and then we can maybe question it or criticize that. He mentions this, and you can see the italics there. The greatest love I can have for another is to love him as myself. I cannot love another more than I love myself. Our duties toward others therefore constitute the supreme condition and the principle of all morality. He who transgresses against himself loses his manliness and becomes incapable of doing his duty toward his fellows. So just be aware of that. That's a key piece. You can't love somebody more than you love yourself. And according to Kant, the categorical imperative is not reducible to the golden rule. He talks about the golden rule there: do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. And he gives some reasons there at the bottom of the page. You can see Chaffee actually lists those out as to why he thinks the categorical imperative is simply not just another version of the golden rule. It's actually something deeper and more powerful. That's something as well you could at least make sure you understand, and then if you want to challenge that. I want to recognize again, Kant is difficult. It doesn't mean it's not true. Sometimes we need to be careful because if something seems overly difficult, well, how is this practical? How could this even be true? So we need to wrestle with that issue. Just because it's difficult to understand doesn't mean there's not something of value for us here. Matter of fact, a few positives of Kant's ethics, just so we conclude. Its emphasis on duty. We think of duty and we think of something maybe dreary, but it doesn't have to be that. Duty captures a moral intuition that some things are right no matter what. That's a key moral intuition, so duty attempts to capture that. Kant's system also mentions that ethical beliefs are right or wrong, and so relativism is refuted. If we want to not have relativism in our ethics, we want to recognize some things are objectively right, some are wrong. Kant's ethical theory attempts to accomplish that. Kant's theory also focuses on reason, and I think we sort of get at the idea that our moral intuitions and our actions should be rational. Moral actions shouldn't be fundamentally irrational. They shouldn't be opposed to reason. And the principles that Kant develops that we've looked at seem to capture something of our moral intuitions. This idea of that which you can universalize, universalizability. That ethics should be applied to everybody, not just a few. Or the respect of persons that we saw in the second formulation. Treat people as ends and not simply as means. They're not simply to be treated as tools. Matter of fact, these two principles are crucial for bioethics. So if you're interested in going in the medical field as a doctor or a nurse, you should be aware these principles are utilized all the time in bioethics. Think about end-of-life issues. How do we treat people? Are they just a thing? Are they just using resources? Or are they an end in themselves? They have value in themselves. Or what about the issue of patient autonomy? Do we treat them like they're children? You don't know as much, so therefore we're going to lie to you, maybe about placebo drugs? Or do we treat you as those to whom we should tell the truth? All sorts of issues that come up in bioethics. So if you're interested in nursing or want to be a doctor, these principles in Kantian ethics pop up all over the place. So you should be aware of them to at least measure your own behavior by those things. All right, that's enough for Kant now. Perhaps maybe we'll do one more video on Kant, and we'll see maybe some of the weak points of his system. All right, thank you.